The first thing you learn as a slave is how to make yourself invisible. Not gone, just unnoticed, a shadow that moves through rooms, tends horses, empties chamber pots, all while the white folks talk as if you have no ears, no mind, no memory. They were wrong about all three. My name is Elijah. I was born on the Caldwell Plantation in the red clay heart of Alabama, where cotton grew thick as gospel and twice as profitable. The year was 1847, though I did not know that then. Time for us was measured differently, by seasons of planting and harvest, by the rhythm of the whip, by how many of us made it through winter. Master Thomas Caldwell was what folks called a gentleman planter. He wore fine suits from Charleston, quoted scripture at Sunday dinner, and believed firmly in the divine order that placed him above me. His wife, Mistress Caroline, collected porcelain dolls and never looked directly at any of us, as if our existence might contaminate her delicate sensibilities. They had 3 children, 2 boys away at university, and a daughter named Margaret, who played piano badly and cried often. I worked the stables, 16 years old, strong enough to handle the master's thoroughbreds, but not so strong that I posed a threat. That was the balance, useful but not dangerous. I was good with the horses. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. They knew I meant no harm, and in their dark eyes I sometimes saw something like understanding. The library window stayed open every night from April to October. Master Caldwell insisted on it, said the hounds needed to come and go freely, that the air circulation prevented mildew on his precious books. That window became my doorway to a world I was forbidden to enter. It started with curiosity, pure, simple, dangerous curiosity. I had seen the master's sons reading, had watched them trace their fingers across pages as if the paper held magic, and maybe it did. Because reading was the one thing that terrified the masters more than rebellion. A slave who could read, could forge a pass, could read about the North, could learn that this life was not the only life possible. The first book I touched was an accident. I was cleaning the library. Yes, they let slaves clean the room but never learn from it, and knocked a volume off the desk. It fell open to a page with an engraving of a ship on the ocean. Beneath it were symbols I could not decode, but I traced them anyway, feeling their shape with my fingertips. Something in my chest opened up that day, like a door I had not known existed. That night, I came back. The window was open, as it always was. The hounds were sleeping by the kitchen hearth. The house was silent, except for Master Caldwell's snoring from the second floor and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I climbed through barefoot, my heart hammering so loud I was certain someone would hear it. The library smelled of leather and tobacco and old paper. Moonlight came through the window in silver strips, just enough to see by. I found the book with the ship again and opened it carefully, as if it might burn me. For an hour, I stared at those strange symbols, trying to make sense of their patterns. I understood nothing, but I memorized the shapes. This became my ritual. Every night after the house slept, I would slip into the library and study the books I could not read. I learned the alphabet first. There was a children's primer on a low shelf, probably left over from when the Caldwell boys were young. A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for cat. Simple pictures with symbols beneath them. I traced each letter 100 times, whispering their sounds in the darkness. Months passed, then a year. The letters became words, the words became sentences, and sentences became a revelation I was reading. Slowly, painfully, but reading. I started with the Bible, because it was the book most often left open. Then law books, because I wanted to understand the rules that bound me. Then anything I could find, agricultural treatises, novels, newspapers the master had finished with. I learned that there were places where slavery was illegal. I learned about court proceedings and property rights and the very legal machinery that made me property. I learned that 3 states north of Alabama, a man could be free just by crossing a border. These were dangerous truths, the kind that get you killed, but knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. The drought came in the summer of 1847. At first, it seemed like any other dry spell. The cotton fields turned brown at the edges, the creek ran lower. But weeks passed with no rain. The cotton withered. The corn dried on the stalk. The master's fortune, built on the labor of 80 souls he claimed to own, began to crumble like the parched earth. I heard the arguments from the library where I cleaned each morning. Master Caldwell shouting at his overseer about yields and profits, Mistress Caroline weeping over unpaid debts. The banks were demanding payment. The creditors were circling. The Caldwell empire was collapsing. That was when I discovered what Master Caldwell was doing in his study late at night. I had come to the library through my usual window route, hungry for more reading, when I heard voices in the adjacent study. The master and his bookkeeper, a thin, nervous man named Porter. I pressed myself against the wall, invisible as always, and listened. They were forging documents, blaming the losses on theft by slaves, on damaged goods, on every lie they could conjure to avoid admitting the truth, that the drought and his own mismanagement had ruined him. Master Caldwell was signing false affidavits, claiming slaves had stolen thousands of dollars in equipment and cotton. He planned to file insurance claims, to sue his own overseer for negligence, to manufacture a scandal that would shift blame away from himself. My people would pay the price. False accusations meant whippings, sales, families torn apart, all to protect a white man's reputation. I stood there in the darkness, my back against the wall, and made a decision that would change everything. The next night I did not just read. I copied. Master Caldwell kept carbon paper in his desk for making duplicates. I took 2 sheets and a pen. Then I went through every document I could find, the false affidavits, the forged reports, the fabricated insurance claims. I copied each one exactly, matching his signature stroke for stroke. I had spent years reading his handwriting. I knew the way he crossed his T's, the flourish on his C. I became him on paper. For 3 weeks, I worked. Every document that passed through his study, I duplicated. Every lie, I recorded. I was building a case against him using his own words, his own crimes, documented in his own hand. The question was what to do with it. I could not simply mail it to the authorities. A letter from a slave would be dismissed, if not punished. But a letter from Master Thomas Caldwell himself, confessing his fraud, sent to Judge Harrison in Montgomery. That would be taken seriously. I crafted the letter carefully, using the formal language I had learned from his legal books. I made it sound like a crisis of conscience, a gentleman admitting his wrongs. I enclosed copies of every forged document, every false claim, and I signed it with his signature, perfect down to the smallest detail. Then I walked 5 miles to the postal station in town, wearing the overseer's coat I had stolen from the stables, and mailed it before dawn. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Life continued as it always had. Work, exhaustion, stolen hours with books that were teaching me how to unmake the world that claimed to own me. I began to wonder if my letter had been ignored, if my plan had failed. Then the soldiers came. They arrived on a Thursday morning. 3 men in uniform with a warrant from the Montgomery court. I was in the stables when I heard the commotion, shouting, the mistress crying, Master Caldwell's voice rising in protest. I moved to the stable door and watched as they arrested him in his own front yard, in front of his slaves, in front of his family. Fraud, forgery, attempted insurance fraud. The charges were read aloud while Mistress Caroline fainted and had to be carried inside. The plantation overseer stood silent, calculating his own survival, and I stood in the shadows, watching the man who owned me being dragged away in chains. The irony was not lost on me. Within a week, the plantation was seized by the court. The creditors descended like vultures, selling off everything: furniture, equipment, livestock, land, and slaves. We were to be sold to pay Master Caldwell's debts, scattered to new plantations, new masters, new horrors. But I had no intention of being there when the auction came. The night before the sale, I packed what little I had, the clothes on my back, a few pages torn from books, and the knowledge I had stolen from the master's library. Then I walked off the Caldwell Plantation and did not look back. The road north was not a road at all, but a series of careful decisions made in darkness. I traveled by night, slept in tobacco barns and cornfields during the day, and kept the North Star always ahead of me like a promise written in light. Freedom was not a place but a direction, and I followed it with the single-minded focus of a man who had tasted knowledge and found it sweeter than safety. I had memorized maps from the master's study. I knew that Alabama bordered Tennessee, that Tennessee bordered Kentucky, that Kentucky bordered the Ohio River, and across that river lay states where the law said a man could not be owned. The distance seemed impossible, over 300 miles through territory where my very existence was a crime. But I had destroyed a plantation with nothing but stolen words. Surely I could walk to freedom. The first week was the hardest. Every sound made me freeze: the snap of a branch, the baying of distant hounds, the voices of white men on the road. I drank from streams and ate whatever I could find or steal. Apples from orchards, eggs from chicken coops, once an entire loaf of bread cooling on a windowsill. I was a ghost, moving through the landscape, trying to become nothing. On the 8th night, I met Samuel. He found me sleeping in his barn outside Huntsville, a massive structure that smelled of hay and horse sweat. I woke to find him standing over me with a pitchfork, his dark face unreadable in the pre-dawn light. He was older than me by maybe 20 years, with graying hair and hands scarred from field work. "You running?" he said. Not a question. I considered lying, then decided truth was faster. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He studied me for a long moment, then lowered the pitchfork. "You got a death wish, boy? They catch you out here by yourself? They'll make an example that'll scare runaways for the next 10 years. I'll take my chances." "Chances." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what chances look like for a young buck traveling alone? You know what patrollers do when they catch you?" I did. I had read the newspaper accounts in Master Caldwell's library, descriptions of punishments, advertisements for captured runaways, rewards for their return. The language was clinical, detached, as if they were discussing livestock, which, in the eyes of the law, we were. Samuel sat down on a hay bale, the pitchfork across his knees. "I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to listen. There's a network. People who help folks like us get north, but you can't just stumble around in the dark hoping to find it. You need to know the signs, the safe houses, the codes." "Tell me." "Can't. Don't know you. Don't know if you're genuine or if you're working for some master trying to trap good people helping runaways." He stood up, brushing hay from his trousers. "But I'll tell you this. There's a blacksmith shop in Fayetteville, Tennessee, man named Josiah. He shoes horses for white folks during the day, and at night he helps people find their way. You mentioned my name, Samuel from the Perkins farm. He might help you, or he might turn you away. That's his choice." "Why are you helping me?" Samuel looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Because somebody helped me once. Before I got caught and brought back, before they branded me and cut the tendon in my left foot so I couldn't run again." He pulled up his pant leg, showing me the grotesque scar, the way his foot turned at an unnatural angle. "I can't run no more, but maybe you can." He gave me food, cornbread and salted pork wrapped in cloth, and directions to Fayetteville. Then he sent me on my way before his master woke and found a runaway in his barn. I thought about Samuel often in the weeks that followed, about the price he had paid for trying to be free, and the fact that he still helped others despite his own failed attempt. There was something holy in that, something that transcended the brutality we lived under. Fayetteville was 2 weeks of hard walking. I crossed into Tennessee on a moonless night, wading through a creek that marked the border. No angels sang, no voice from heaven declared me free. Just cold water and the knowledge that I was one state closer to salvation. Josiah's blacksmith shop sat on the edge of town, a squat building that glowed orange from the forge fire even at night. I waited until after dark, then approached carefully, trying to look like I had legitimate business there. Josiah was a mountain of a man, 6.5 feet tall with arms like tree trunks and a face that gave away nothing. "Samuel from the Perkins farm sent me," I said quietly. He continued hammering the horseshoe on his anvil, the ringing metal drowning out my words. For a moment I thought he had not heard me or had chosen to ignore me. Then he spoke without looking up. "Samuel's a fool for sending strays my way. I got a business here, got a life, can't be risking it for every runaway that comes through." "I understand. Do you?" Now he looked at me, his eyes hard. "You understand what happens to me if they find out I'm helping? They don't just hang you when you're free. They make it slow. They make it public. They make it a lesson. Then don't help me. Just point me north and I'll be gone." He studied me for a long moment, then set down his hammer. "You got that look." "What look?" "The look of a man who's already decided he'd rather die free than live in chains. I've seen it before. It's either gonna get you killed or get you to Canada." He wiped his hands on his leather apron. "You can read?" The question surprised me. "Yes." "How well?" "Well enough." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a newspaper folded open to an article. "Read this." Out loud. I took the paper, finding my place in the lamplight. It was a report from the Charleston Mercury about cotton prices and trade disputes. I read it clearly, pronouncing each word correctly, understanding the economic arguments being made. When I finished, Josiah was smiling, actually smiling. "Samuel was right to send you. A literate runaway is worth 10 illiterate ones. You can forge passes, read wanted posters, understand the laws they use against us." He folded the newspaper and tucked it away. "I'm going to help you, not because I'm a good man, I'm not, but because you're valuable. The movement needs people like you." That night, Josiah explained the Underground Railroad in detail. It was not actually underground, nor was it a railroad. It was a network of safe houses, secret routes, and coded messages that helped slaves escape to free states and Canada. Conductors guided runaways along the route, station masters provided shelter, and the passengers, people like me, moved from station to station like freight being shipped north. Except the freight was human, and the cargo was hope. He gave me a map, drawn on a piece of cloth that I could hide in my clothes. It showed the route north through Tennessee into Kentucky, marking safe houses with tiny crosses that would mean nothing to anyone who did not know the code. He taught me the phrases, "A friend with friends," "The wind blows from the south." "I'm looking for the drinking gourd," passwords and countersigns that would identify me to those who might help. "The hardest part is Kentucky," Josiah warned. "It's a border state. Legal slavery, but close enough to free territory that the slave catchers are everywhere. They know most runaways come through there. You'll need to be more careful than you've ever been." I spent 3 days with Josiah, sleeping in his shop, learning everything he could teach me about survival. He showed me how to use the North Star for navigation, how to tell if I was being followed, how to move through terrain without leaving tracks. He was training me like a soldier preparing for war, because that is what this was, a war for my own soul. On the 4th day, he sent me north with supplies and a warning. "Trust no one completely, not even the people at the safe houses. There are bounty hunters who pretend to be conductors, who lure runaways in and then turn them over for the reward. Always have an escape route, always be ready to run." I traveled through Tennessee in late autumn, when the leaves turned gold and red and the nights grew cold. I moved from safe house to safe house, a Quaker farm near Nashville, a free black family in Clarksville, a white abolitionist minister who hid me in his church basement for 2 days while slave catchers searched the town. Each stop was a miracle. Each person who helped me was risking everything, and I carried that weight with me like a stone. In Kentucky, I learned what fear truly meant. The slave catchers there were organized, methodical, and brutal. They worked in teams with dogs, trained to track human scent. They offered rewards so high that even sympathetic whites might be tempted to turn you in. And they did not always follow the law. Many runaways who were caught simply disappeared, sold south to plantations in Mississippi or Louisiana, where no one would ask questions. I was crossing through Lexington when I had my first real close call. I was walking at night along a country road, keeping to the shadows, when I heard horses behind me. I dove into the underbrush just as 3 riders came around the bend, their lanterns swinging. Slave catchers, discussing a recent capture, laughing about the money they would collect. I lay motionless in the cold mud, barely breathing as they passed within 10 feet of where I hid. One of the horses spooked at something. Maybe it smelled me, and the rider pulled up, scanning the roadside with his lantern. The light passed over my hiding spot, and for a moment I was certain I was caught. Then the horse settled and they moved on, their laughter fading into the distance. I stayed in that mud for 2 hours, shaking from cold and fear, before I dared to move. The safe house near Louisville was run by a German immigrant named Friedrich, who spoke broken English and believed slavery was an abomination before God. He hid me in a false cellar beneath his kitchen, a space so small I could not stand upright, and brought me food twice a day. I stayed there for a week while he made arrangements for the next leg of my journey. "The Ohio River is close," he told me in his thick accent. "Maybe 3 miles. But it is the most dangerous 3 miles you will ever walk. The river is watched, always watched. Slave catchers on this side, kidnappers on the other side, ready to grab free blacks and sell them south. You must be very, very careful." He arranged for a ferryman, a free black man named Marcus, who ran a legitimate ferry service during the day and smuggled runaways at night. The crossing would happen in 3 days, during the new moon when the darkness was absolute. I spent those 3 days in the cellar reading by candlelight. Friedrich had given me books, real books, not stolen ones, and I devoured them like a starving man. Political philosophy, poetry, speeches from abolitionists. These were words that had been forbidden to me my entire life, ideas that were considered too dangerous for slaves to encounter. And now I understood why. These books did not just describe freedom. They argued for it, insisted upon it, declared it an inalienable right. If slaves could read these words, the entire system would collapse. The night of the crossing was cold and moonless, exactly as planned. Friedrich led me through back streets to the river, where Marcus waited with a small rowboat. The Ohio River was wide and black, its far shore invisible in the darkness. "Once you cross, you're in Indiana," Marcus said quietly. "That's free territory, but don't think you're safe. They still catch runaways in free states, drag them back south under the fugitive slave law. You need to keep moving north, all the way to Canada if you can." "I will." "Good." He pushed the boat into the water. "Get in, stay low. Don't make a sound." The crossing took maybe 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Every ripple of water sounded like thunder. Every distant light on shore seemed like a threat. Marcus rowed with practiced silence, his oars barely disturbing the surface. And then the boat scraped against the far shore, and he whispered 2 words that changed my life. "You're free." Freedom was not what I expected. I had imagined it as a feeling, a lightness, some fundamental shift in the nature of reality. Instead, it was just cold mud on the Indiana shore and the knowledge that I was still being hunted. The fugitive slave law of 1793 meant that even in free states, I could be captured and returned to slavery. My freedom was legal but not secure, a technicality that offered little comfort. Marcus had given me directions to a safe house in Jeffersonville, just across the river from Louisville. It was run by a Quaker couple named Jeremiah and Martha Thompson, who had been helping runaways for 15 years. I found their farm just before dawn, a modest white house with a red barn that looked like 1,000 other farms in the territory. I knocked on the door using the code. 3 quick raps, pause, 2 more. Martha answered, a small woman with grey hair and eyes that assessed me quickly, clinically, the way you might examine a horse for injuries. You look half-starved, she said, ushering me inside. When did you last eat properly? I don't remember. She sat me at her kitchen table and brought food, real food, not scraps, eggs and bacon and bread with butter and jam. I ate slowly, trying not to seem desperate, but I was desperate. I'd been running for nearly 2 months, living on whatever I could find or steal, and my body was wearing down. Jeremiah came in from the barn, a tall man with a beard going white and hands calloused from farm work. He studied me with the same clinical assessment as his wife. You're the one Friedrich sent word about, he said. The one who can read. Yes, sir. Don't call me sir. I'm Jeremiah. This is Martha. We don't hold with titles that imply one person is above another. He sat down across from me. Friedrich says you're educated. How educated? I can read and write. I know arithmetic. I've studied law books and scripture and... Can you teach? The question surprised me. Teach? There are free black communities in Indiana, Ohio, even in Canada. Children who need education, adults who never had the chance to learn. If you can teach others to read and write, you're not just saving yourself, you're building something. I had not thought beyond survival, had not imagined a future where I might do anything except run and hide. But the idea took root immediately, teaching others what I had stolen from Master Caldwell's library, passing on the knowledge that had made me dangerous. I could teach, I said. I'd like to teach. Martha smiled. Then you'll stay with us for a while. Rest, eat properly, regain your strength. And when you're ready, we'll help you get further north to where you'll be safer. I stayed with the Thompsons for 3 weeks. They treated me not as a runaway or a charity case, but as a guest. I ate at their table, slept in a real bed, and for the first time in my life experienced what it meant to be treated as fully human. Jeremiah taught me about the abolitionist movement, about the political battles being fought in Congress over slavery's expansion, about the growing tension between North and South. Martha taught me practical things, how to dress like a free man, how to carry myself with confidence rather than the hunched-over posture of someone expecting a whip. But the most important thing they gave me was documentation. You need papers, Jeremiah explained one evening. Free papers that prove you're not a runaway. Without them, any slave catcher can grab you and claim you're their property. The burden of proof is on you to demonstrate you're free. He had connections with sympathetic clerks and lawyers who would create false documentation for runaways. It cost money, which the Thompsons paid, and it required a new identity. Elijah the slave from Alabama ceased to exist. In his place was Elijah Freeman, born free in Pennsylvania, 23 years old. Occupation listed as laborer. The papers were beautifully forged, complete with official-looking seals and signatures. They would not hold up to serious scrutiny, but they might prevent casual questioning. They were armor made of lies, and I wore them gratefully. In early December, the Thompsons arranged for me to travel further north to Cincinnati, where there was a larger free black community and more opportunities for work and education. They gave me money, actual money, coins that jingled in my pocket like a foreign language, and put me on a legitimate stagecoach like any other passenger. Sitting in that coach, dressed in decent clothes with papers in my pocket, I felt the full weight of my transformation. 2 months ago, I had been property. Now I was pretending to be a person, and the pretense was becoming real. Cincinnati was unlike anything I had seen. The city sprawled along the Ohio River, a chaotic mixture of warehouses and churches, wealthy neighborhoods and desperate slums, white faces and black faces, and immigrants speaking languages I could not identify. The free black community lived mostly in an area called Bucktown, where narrow houses pressed against each other, and the streets smelled of coal smoke and cooking. I found lodging in a boarding house run by a woman named Beatrice, who charged reasonable rates and asked few questions. She was from Virginia originally, had purchased her own freedom 20 years ago, and now made her living housing other former slaves trying to build new lives. "You got that look," she said when I paid my first week's rent. "Fresh off the river, still expecting someone to grab you. Is it that obvious? Only to those of us who've been there." She handed me a key. "Rooms on the second floor. Outhouses in back. And if slave catchers come around asking questions, I don't know you, and I've never seen you, understood?" Understood. Cincinnati had a thriving abolitionist community, and I was introduced to it through a man named Theodore Weld, a white preacher who ran a school for black children and adults. The school operated semi-legally. Ohio law did not forbid educating free blacks, but it was heavily frowned upon, and mobs had attacked similar schools in the past. Theodore interviewed me in his small office, surrounded by books and maps and abolitionist newspapers. He was thin and intense, with eyes that seemed to burn with perpetual righteous anger. "The Thompsons wrote to me about you," he said. "They say you're exceptionally well-read for someone who learned in secret. What have you studied?" I listed the books I could remember from Master Caldwell's library: law texts, political philosophy, scripture, agricultural treatises, novels. Theodore listened with growing excitement. "You've read Blackstone's commentaries and Locke's second treatise?" "Yes." "Can you discuss them, actually engage with the ideas?" John Locke argues that government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and that people have natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. Slavery violates all three principles because it removes consent, denies liberty, and treats humans as property rather than rights-bearing individuals. Theodore actually laughed. "You're going to be very useful. How would you feel about teaching?" That was how I became a teacher. Theodore hired me to work at his school, instructing both children and adults in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The pay was minimal, but it was honest work that served a purpose beyond survival. I was taking what I had stolen from Master Caldwell's library and giving it to people who had been denied it their entire lives. The students ranged from 6-year-old children who had never seen a letter to 70-year-old men who wept when they finally read their first sentence. I taught them the alphabet using the same primer I had taught myself. I taught them to write their names, simple signatures that transformed them from marks on a bill of sale to people who could sign documents, who could make their existence official. And I taught them mathematics because numbers were power. The ability to count your wages, to calculate percentages, to understand contracts, these skills protected you from being cheated, from being taken advantage of. Frederick Douglass had written that education was the pathway from slavery to freedom. I was building that pathway one student at a time, but teaching in Cincinnati was dangerous work. The city sat right on the border between slavery and freedom, and tensions were constant. Pro-slavery mobs from Kentucky would sometimes cross the river to intimidate abolitionists. Slave catchers operated openly, grabbing black residents and claiming they were runaways, often without bothering to check if the person was legally free. And there were white Cincinnati residents who resented the growing black population, who saw us as competition for jobs or simply as an offense to their racial worldview. In February of 1848, the violence came to Theodore's school. It was evening, and I was teaching a class of adult students, former slaves and free-born blacks, learning to read by lamplight. We were working through a passage from the Bible, Ruth's declaration to Naomi, when rocks started crashing through the windows. The mob outside was maybe 30 strong, white men shouting about sending the niggers back where they belong and keeping Cincinnati white. They had torches and clubs, and their intention was clear. They meant to destroy the school and everyone in it. Theodore tried to reason with them, standing at the door with his hands raised. These are free people exercising their legal right to education. You have no cause. Someone hit him with a club. He went down hard, blood streaming from his scalp. That was when something in me broke and reformed. I had spent my entire life being told to submit, to accept, to endure. I had chosen theft and escape over violence, had believed that words and knowledge were the only weapons I needed. But watching Theodore fall, seeing my students, people who trusted me to protect them as well as teach them, cowering in fear, I understood that sometimes words were not enough. "Everyone out the back door!" I shouted. "Now!" I grabbed Theodore under his arms and dragged him toward the rear exit while my students fled. The mob was breaking down the front door, their voices rising in bloodlust. I got Theodore outside just as the building began to burn, flames climbing the walls with terrifying speed. We regrouped in Beatrice's boarding house, treating Theodore's head wound and taking stock of what we had lost. The school was gone, burned to the foundation. All our books, all our supplies, everything we had built, destroyed in one night of rage. But sitting there in that crowded room, surrounded by students who had escaped the fire, I realized something important. The mob had destroyed the building, but they had not destroyed what we had created. The people I had taught still knew how to read. The knowledge I had given them still existed. You cannot burn down an idea. "We rebuild," Theodore said through gritted teeth, his head wrapped in bandages. "They want us to run, to hide, to give up. So we rebuild. Somewhere else, somewhere safer, but we rebuild." And we did. With donations from abolitionists in Boston and New York, we established a new school in a building with better security and more supportive neighbors. I continued teaching, but now with a sharper understanding of what we were up against. Every lesson was an act of defiance. Every student who learned to read was a victory against the system that had tried to keep us ignorant. Spring came to Cincinnati with rain that washed the ash from the burned school into the Ohio River. I watched it run down the street in gray streams and thought about purification, about how fire could destroy a building but not a movement. The new school Theodore established was smaller, tucked into the basement of a sympathetic church, but it was safer. The congregation provided security, and the black community rallied to protect what we were building. My reputation as a teacher grew. Word spread through Bucktown and beyond. There was a young man from Alabama who could read law books and scripture with equal facility, who explained complex ideas in simple terms, who treated every student with dignity regardless of their age or background. People came from across Cincinnati and from neighboring towns. I taught morning classes for children, afternoon sessions for working adults, and evening groups for those who could only come after dark. One evening in April, a woman appeared at the school door. She was perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested she had seen trouble and survived it. Her name was Rebecca, and she had walked 15 miles from a small town upriver to find me. "I heard you teach more than just reading," she said. "I teach whatever people need to learn. Can you teach me law? The kind that might help free people still in bondage?" I invited her inside. The evening class was finishing up, students laboriously copying sentences from the Bible. Rebecca watched them with an expression I recognized: hunger for knowledge, determination to make up for lost time. After the class dispersed, we sat in the empty schoolroom and talked. Rebecca had been born free in Ohio, daughter of freed slaves who had purchased their own liberty decades ago. But her younger brother had been kidnapped 2 years ago, grabbed by slave catchers who claimed he was a runaway, and dragged back to Kentucky before anyone could produce his free papers. The family had been trying to get him back ever since, but they lacked understanding of the legal system, of which arguments might work, of how to navigate courts that were inherently hostile to black people. "I need to understand the law well enough to fight it," Rebecca said. "Not just read it, understand it. Can you teach me that?" Over the following months, Rebecca became my most dedicated student. She came 3 times a week, and I taught her everything I had learned from Master Caldwell's law books. We studied the Constitution and its contradictions, how it proclaimed liberty while protecting slavery, how it counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, but 0 persons for rights. We examined the Fugitive Slave Act, the Northwest Ordinance, state laws regarding free blacks and manumission. I taught her to think like a lawyer, to find loopholes and contradictions, to understand how law could be both weapon and shield. But Rebecca taught me something too. She had connections throughout the black community, knew people who were organizing resistance networks, helping runaways, documenting kidnappings and illegal enslavements. Through her, I began to understand that my escape from Alabama had been possible only because of a vast network of people risking everything to help strangers. Now I was part of that network, contributing my own skills to the collective effort toward freedom. One summer night, Rebecca brought me a proposal that would change everything. "There's a case," she said, spreading papers on my desk. "A family in Ripley, mother and 3 children. They escaped from Virginia 6 months ago, made it across the river, but the master tracked them down. He's filed a claim under the Fugitive Slave Act to have them returned. The hearing is in 2 weeks. What can I do?" The mother can read a little, taught herself like you did. She wants to testify on her own behalf, but she needs to understand the legal arguments, needs to know what questions they'll ask, how to respond. I told her about you. "I'm not a lawyer." "No, but you understand law better than most lawyers, and you've been where she is, running, hiding, fighting to stay free. That matters." I agreed to help. The family was hiding in a safe house outside Ripley, a town perched on the Ohio River that was famous in abolitionist circles. The minister there, a man named John Rankin, had been helping runaways for years. His house a beacon visible from the Kentucky shore. I met the family in Rankin's parlor. The mother's name was Sarah, a woman of maybe 25 with 3 children under 10 years old. She had a scar across her face from where the master had struck her with a branding iron, and her hands showed years of fieldwork. But her eyes were sharp, and when I asked her to read from a document, she did so haltingly but accurately. "I learned secret," she said, "like you did. Master's sons would leave books around, and I'd steal looks when I could. Taught myself the letters, then the words. Never told nobody. That's going to help you. The judge might respect that. The judge is white. He don't respect nothing about me except that I'm somebody's property he thinks should be returned." She was right, of course. The legal system was designed to favor slave owners, to make recovery of runaways as easy as possible. But there were procedural requirements, evidentiary standards, arguments that could be made. I spent 3 days preparing Sarah for her testimony, teaching her how to present her case, how to articulate why she deserved freedom. The hearing was held in a small courthouse in Ripley before a judge named Morrison, who had a reputation for strictly interpreting the Fugitive Slave Act in favor of slave owners. The courtroom was packed. Abolitionists supporting Sarah, slave catchers and pro-slavery advocates hoping to see her returned, and curious locals who treated the proceeding like entertainment. Sarah's former master, a Virginia planter named Whitfield, sat in the front row, dressed in expensive clothes and radiating confidence. His lawyer was polished and professional, presenting documentation that Sarah and her children were his legal property, that they had fled without cause, that the law required their return. Sarah represented herself because no lawyer would take her case. Most wouldn't represent black clients, and those few who would couldn't do so without payment. But I had prepared her well, teaching her to speak clearly, to challenge the documentation, to question whether Whitfield had followed proper procedures. She stood before the judge, a thin woman in borrowed clothes with 3 frightened children beside her, and argued for her freedom with words I had taught her. "Your Honor, the document Mr. Whitfield presents as proof of ownership is dated January 1847. But I was born in 1823 in North Carolina, not Virginia. My mother was a free woman who was kidnapped and sold south when I was 5 years old. I was never legally enslaved, which means I cannot legally be returned to slavery." It was a lie. Sarah had been born enslaved on Whitfield's Virginia plantation, as we both knew, but the documentation Whitfield provided did not prove that. It only showed recent ownership records. And without birth records or other corroborating evidence, Sarah's testimony created reasonable doubt. Whitfield's lawyer objected strenuously, but Judge Morrison seemed intrigued. This was unusual. Most runaway cases were straightforward, with clear documentation and quick decisions. Sarah's challenge introduced complexity, uncertainty, the possibility that returning her might violate the law if she was actually free. The hearing stretched across 2 days. Sarah testified about her kidnapping as a child, about growing up in Virginia without ever legally being enslaved, about fleeing when she learned that Whitfield planned to sell her children away from her. I had coached her on every detail, helping her construct a plausible alternative history that fit the gaps in Whitfield's documentation. On the second day, Judge Morrison issued his ruling. "I find insufficient evidence to definitively establish Mrs. Sarah's legal status as enslaved property of Mr. Whitfield. While Mr. Whitfield's recent ownership documents appear valid, they do not address the plaintiff's claim of free birth. In the absence of clear and convincing evidence, I cannot in good conscience order the return of potentially free individuals to bondage. Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Abolitionists cheered. Whitfield shouted about injustice and corrupt northern judges. His lawyer immediately filed appeals. But in that moment, Sarah was free to remain in Ohio with her children, free from the immediate threat of being dragged back to Virginia. She found me outside the courthouse, tears streaming down her face, and gripped my hand so tightly I thought she might break bones. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved yourself. You spoke the words. I just taught you which words to say." But I knew it was more than that. I had taken the knowledge I had stolen from Master Caldwell's library, the legal concepts, the rhetorical strategies, the understanding of how power operated through language, and weaponized it on behalf of people who were supposed to remain powerless. This was what literacy meant, not just reading and writing, but the ability to challenge systems, to find cracks in legal structures, to use the master's own tools against him. Word of Sarah's case spread through abolitionist networks. Other runaways facing hearings sought my help. I became a kind of informal legal advisor, preparing people to defend themselves, teaching them how to challenge documentation, how to create doubt about their legal status. I won some cases and lost others, but every victory proved that the system could be fought, that knowledge was power, even when you had no official standing. Theodore noticed how my work was evolving beyond simple teaching. One evening he came to my room with a proposal. "There's a network," he said carefully. "People working to help those still in bondage, not just runaways, but organizing resistance, documenting abuses, building legal challenges. They need people who understand both slavery and law, who can move between worlds, people like you. What are you asking? For you to do more than teach, to use what you know to help others fight. It's dangerous work, more dangerous than running a school, but it's important work." I thought about Master Caldwell rotting in an Alabama prison, convicted by his own forged documents. I thought about Sarah and her children, free because I had taught her how to manipulate legal language. I thought about all the books I had read in secret, all the knowledge I had stolen, and what that knowledge was for. "Tell me what needs to be done." The work Theodore introduced me to operated in shadows and required a particular kind of courage I had not needed as a runaway. Running meant moving, staying ahead of pursuers, keeping your own freedom as the goal. This new work meant staying in place while helping others escape, documenting horrors while pretending ignorance, building networks while appearing isolated. It meant living a double life, Elijah Freeman, the humble schoolteacher by day, and something else entirely after dark. The network called itself the Committee of Vigilance, though we never used that name aloud. We were scattered throughout Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, free blacks, white abolitionists, Quakers, radical Christians, people who believed slavery was a sin requiring active resistance. We passed information about slave catchers operating in free states, warned runaways about dangerous routes, documented kidnappings of free blacks, and occasionally helped plan rescues of people who had been illegally seized. My role was specialized. I compiled evidence. Slavery was built on paperwork, bills of sale, transfer documents, breeding records, punishment logs. Every enslaved person existed in duplicate, both as a human being and as documentation of property. The system depended on these records being accurate and accepted as legitimate. My job was to find the cracks in that system, the forged documents, the illegal transactions, the cases where free blacks had been kidnapped and fraudulently enslaved. I worked with other members of the committee who had access to courthouse records, county clerks who were sympathetic to our cause, lawyers who quietly passed along information. We built case files demonstrating systematic fraud in the slave trade. Instances where free people had been seized without due process, where documentation had been falsified, where the legal mechanisms supposedly protecting the rights of free blacks had been deliberately ignored. This was dangerous knowledge. Slave traders did not appreciate having their fraudulent practices exposed. Plantation owners did not like evidence of their crimes being compiled. And the law, despite its pretensions to neutrality, generally protected those with wealth and power rather than those with justice on their side. But I had learned from my time with Master Caldwell that documentation could be a weapon. The right evidence placed before the right judge could free an enslaved person, or convict a slave trader, or expose the rot at the heart of the system. Words on paper had destroyed the Caldwell Plantation. Maybe they could do more. In August of 1848, I received word through the network about a case in Pennsylvania that needed immediate attention. A young woman named Hannah, legally free and living in Philadelphia, had been kidnapped by slave catchers who claimed she was a runaway from Maryland. She had been dragged across state lines and was being held in a Baltimore jail, awaiting sale to a plantation in Georgia. The kidnappers had forged documentation saying she was a slave named Clarissa who had escaped 2 years earlier. "We need proof she's free," Theodore explained, showing me the sparse information we had. Birth records, manumission papers, anything that establishes her legal status. Without that, she'll be sold south and lost forever. I traveled to Philadelphia, a city I had never seen, carrying forged papers identifying me as a clerk, researching property records. Philadelphia was massive, nearly 200,000 people, more than I had imagined could live in one place. The free black community there was well established, with churches, businesses, mutual aid societies, and social organizations that would have been impossible in Ohio. Hannah's family lived in a narrow row house in a neighborhood called Southwark. Her mother, Ruth, was a washerwoman who had purchased her own freedom 30 years ago and subsequently freed Hannah at birth. She had the manumission papers, yellowed, brittle but legally valid documents establishing that Hannah had been born free. "The slave catchers took her right off the street," Ruth told me, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "She was coming home from work, just walking, and they grabbed her, threw her in a wagon and drove off before anyone could react. By the time we knew what happened, they'd already taken her across into Maryland." "Did she have her free papers with her?" "No. Who carries papers just walking home? She lived here her whole life. Everyone knew her." That was the vulnerability. Free blacks were supposed to carry documentation proving their status at all times, but most didn't because it was impractical and because they lived in communities where everyone knew everyone. Kidnappers exploited this, grabbing people who looked vulnerable and manufacturing documentation to support their claim of ownership. I copied Ruth's manumission papers and gathered affidavits from neighbors testifying to Hannah's identity and free status. Then I traveled to Baltimore, a border city where slavery was legal and the trade in human beings was a major industry. The jail where Hannah was being held was near the waterfront, a grim stone building that held both convicted criminals and enslaved people awaiting sale. I could not simply walk in and demand to see her. I was a black man in a slave state, carrying dubious papers, trying to interfere with a profitable transaction. The wrong approach would get me arrested, or worse. Instead, I hired a white lawyer named Thomas Mitchell, who had a reputation for taking controversial cases. Mitchell was young, ambitious, and genuinely appalled by the kidnapping trade. I showed him the evidence I had gathered, explained Hannah's situation, and watched his jaw clench with anger. "This happens constantly," he said. "Free blacks kidnapped and sold south, their families with no recourse because the legal system protects the kidnappers. We'll file a writ of habeas corpus, force the court to review her detention. If we can prove she's legally free, they'll have to release her." The hearing was held before a Maryland judge named Pemberton, who seemed annoyed at having his time wasted with what he clearly viewed as an unnecessary proceeding. The kidnapper's lawyer argued that Hannah was obviously the escaped slave Clarissa, that the documentation proved it, that interfering with the lawful recovery of property was itself a crime. Mitchell presented Ruth's manumission papers, the affidavits from Philadelphia neighbors, and testimony from Ruth herself, who had traveled to Baltimore at great personal risk to testify on her daughter's behalf. He built a meticulous case demonstrating that Hannah and Clarissa were different people, that the kidnappers' documentation was fraudulent, that this was not recovery of property but theft of a free person. Judge Pemberton listened with visible impatience, then delivered his ruling without deliberation. "The manumission papers appear legitimate. The affidavits are compelling. I find insufficient evidence that the detained woman is the escaped slave Clarissa. She is to be released immediately into the custody of her mother." Hannah walked out of that Baltimore jail a free woman, but the experience had marked her. She was thin and bruised, her eyes showing trauma that would take years to heal if it healed at all. She clung to her mother and wept, and I stood watching, thinking about all the people who were kidnapped without anyone filing writs or gathering evidence, who disappeared into the southern plantations and were never seen again. This was the work, not just teaching reading and writing, but fighting for people who had no other advocates, using law and documentation and procedure as weapons against a system designed to reduce human beings to property. I returned to Cincinnati with a deeper understanding of what we were fighting. It was not just slavery in the abstract, not just an institution that existed somewhere else. It was an ongoing process of violence and theft that reached into free states, that kidnapped free people, that corrupted every level of government and law enforcement. The boundaries between slave and free states were not protective barriers, but contested zones where human predators operated openly. The Committee of Vigilance intensified its work. We documented hundreds of kidnapping cases, built networks to warn free blacks about known kidnappers, developed rapid response systems to file legal challenges before victims could be taken too far south. And we taught, always taught, because literacy and legal knowledge were the best protections against a system that depended on its victims remaining ignorant. But as fall arrived, bringing cold winds down from Canada, we began hearing rumors of something bigger. Tensions between North and South were escalating. Political debates over slavery's expansion into new territories were becoming increasingly violent, and there were whispers, unconfirmed, frightening whispers, that the slave states might attempt secession, might try to break away from the Union rather than accept any limits on their ability to own and exploit human beings. Theodore called a meeting of the committee leadership in November. We gathered in a church basement in Cincinnati, perhaps 30 people representing networks across the North. The mood was tense, worried. "The situation is deteriorating," Theodore said without preamble. "Southern politicians are talking openly about leaving the Union. If that happens, if war comes, everything changes." "Changes how?" someone asked. "War might mean liberation. It might mean a chance to end slavery entirely, everywhere, permanently." He paused. "Or it might mean the South fights to preserve slavery and wins, in which case every gain we've made, every person we've helped, every law we've passed, all of it could be reversed. Free states could become slave states. Freedom itself could become illegal." The room was silent, everyone processing the magnitude of what he was saying. "We need to be ready," Theodore continued, "ready to escalate if war comes, ready to protect the people in our communities, ready to document everything, every crime, every atrocity, every violation, so that when this is over, whenever it's over, we have evidence of what was done. Truth matters, records matter. The work you're all doing, gathering evidence, compiling cases, that work might be the difference between justice and amnesia." I thought about Master Caldwell's forged documents, the evidence I had gathered and used to destroy him. I thought about Hannah's manumission papers, the affidavits that freed her. I thought about Sarah's testimony, the legal arguments that kept her children safe, documentation, evidence, words on paper that could free people or condemn them. "I'll keep gathering evidence," I said. "Whatever comes, we'll have records. They won't be able to deny what they did." The war came in April of 1861, though we had felt its approach for years, like a storm building on the horizon. The slave states seceded one by one, forming their own nation dedicated explicitly to the preservation of slavery. The shooting started at Fort Sumter, but the conflict had been burning long before the first shots, burning in bleeding Kansas, in courtrooms where fugitive slaves were returned to bondage, in the hearts of people who could no longer reconcile freedom and slavery existing in the same nation. I was 30 years old by then, a teacher and organizer and keeper of records. I had spent 13 years in freedom, building networks, documenting injustices, helping hundreds of people escape bondage or fight to remain free. The work had made me known in abolitionist circles, the former slave who used knowledge as a weapon, who had destroyed his master with forged evidence and then spent his freedom helping others do the same. When President Lincoln called for troops to suppress the rebellion, I tried to enlist. I wanted to fight, wanted to take up arms against the system that had claimed to own me, but the army would not accept black soldiers, not at first. This was a white man's war, they said, even though it was being fought over our bodies, our labor, our humanity. So I continued the work I had been doing, but with new urgency. As Union armies advanced into Confederate territory, they encountered enslaved people by the thousands fleeing to Union lines. These refugees, called contrabands, as if they were smuggled goods rather than human beings, needed help, organization, education. They needed exactly what I had been providing for over a decade. The government established contraband camps, chaotic settlements where formerly enslaved people gathered under Union protection. I was sent to one of these camps in Northern Virginia in 1862, tasked with establishing schools and helping people navigate their new freedom. The camp held perhaps 3,000 people living in makeshift shelters, without adequate food or medicine or sanitation. They had escaped from nearby plantations when Union troops approached, walking away from the only lives they had known, with nothing but the clothes they wore. And now they were free, legally, technically free, but freedom without resources or education or support was barely freedom at all. I recognized their faces, not literally. I'd never met these specific people, but I recognized the expression, the combination of hope and terror that comes with sudden liberation. They were where I had been in 1847, standing on the Indiana shore, wondering what freedom actually meant. I established a school in a tent, teaching with whatever materials I could find, scraps of paper, charcoal for writing, a few donated books. Students ranged from children to elderly people who had lived their entire lives in bondage and now wanted to learn to read before they died. I taught them letters and words and arithmetic, but I also taught them about rights, about law, about how to navigate a world that was supposedly free but still hostile to black people. One of my students was a young man named Thomas, perhaps 19 years old, who had escaped from a plantation in South Carolina. He was sharp, ambitious, hungry for knowledge in a way that reminded me of myself at his age. He absorbed everything I taught him with fierce concentration, staying after class to ask questions, borrowing books to read by firelight. "I want to fight," he told me one evening. "Not just learn. Fight. Actually fight. The army still won't take black soldiers. Then we'll make them take us. There's talk of forming Negro regiments, units of black soldiers led by white officers. If that happens, I'm enlisting. I want to carry a rifle into my old master's plantation and show him what freedom looks like." I understood the anger, the need to fight back physically after a lifetime of enforced submission. But I also knew that fighting took many forms. "Violence is one kind of power," I said, "but so is knowledge. When you learn to read, you take power away from people who depend on you staying ignorant. When you understand law, you can fight them in courts. When you document their crimes, you make it impossible for them to pretend they were honorable men. I can do both, learn and fight." He was right, of course. The war would need soldiers and teachers, fighters and organizers. There was room for all of it. In January 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in rebel states to be legally free. It was a war measure, not a moral statement, limited in scope and questionable in enforceability. But it changed something fundamental. It made the war explicitly about slavery, made Union victory equivalent to abolition, and it opened the door for black soldiers. Thomas was among the first to enlist when the 54th Massachusetts Infantry was formed. I watched him march away with his regiment, rifle on his shoulder, wearing the Union uniform he had earned the right to wear. He died 6 months later at Fort Wagner, part of an assault that failed militarily, but proved black soldiers would fight with as much courage as any white troops. I grieved for him, for all the young men who died in that war. But I also understood that their sacrifice was not pointless. Every battle proved that black people were not passive victims waiting for white saviors. We were agents of our own liberation, fighting for it, dying for it, making it happen through force of will and force of arms. I continued teaching throughout the war, moving from camp to camp as Union lines advanced deeper into Confederate territory. I documented everything I saw, the conditions in contraband camps, the testimonies of formerly enslaved people describing their treatment, the names of overseers and masters who had committed atrocities. This was my war work, gathering evidence that could never be denied or forgotten. In 1865, as Confederate armies collapsed and the war entered its final months, I returned to Alabama for the first time since my escape. The Caldwell Plantation still existed, though it was nothing like what I remembered. The fields were overgrown, the big house damaged by fire, the slave quarters abandoned. Master Thomas Caldwell had died in prison years ago, his fortune seized, his name disgraced. The land had been sold to pay debts, then resold, passing through several hands before ending up with a northern investor who had no interest in cotton or slavery. I walked through the ruins of the plantation where I had been born, where I had learned to read in secret, where I had stolen the knowledge that made me free. The library where I had educated myself was destroyed, books scattered and ruined. But standing there among the wreckage, I felt no anger, no desire for revenge. Master Caldwell had destroyed himself. I had simply documented his crimes and let justice take its course. That was what literacy meant. Not violence, but the ability to use systems against themselves, to turn law and evidence and documentation into weapons that could topple empires built on human bondage. The 13th Amendment passed Congress in January 1865, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. The war ended in April with Confederate surrender. After 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed, after 600,000 dead and a nation torn apart, slavery was finally ended. But the work was not finished. Formerly enslaved people needed education, land, political rights, economic opportunities. They needed to be integrated into American society as full citizens, not as a permanent underclass. This would be the work of Reconstruction, and I intended to be part of it. I returned to Cincinnati and resumed teaching, but with a broader mission. The school Theodore and I had built now served hundreds of students. We taught reading and writing, but also history, the true history of slavery and resistance, not the sanitized version white Americans preferred. We taught political organization, how to vote and run for office and demand rights. We taught economic literacy, how to manage money and property and protect yourself from exploitation. One day in 1867, a letter arrived at the school. It was from New Orleans, from a man who signed himself a grateful student. The letter was carefully written with good penmanship and correct grammar. It thanked me for the education I had provided, said that he had taken what he learned and opened his own school, that he was teaching others as he had been taught. The letter reminded me of a rumor I had heard years ago about a man matching my description seen in New Orleans, reading to black children on Sunday mornings. I smiled, realizing the story had become legend, larger than truth, but true in spirit. I had destroyed Master Caldwell's plantation with nothing but stolen knowledge and carefully forged documents. But that was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The knowledge I stole from his library I gave to others. The education I received in secret I provided openly. The freedom I won for myself I worked to secure for everyone. They taught me that I was property, that I had no rights, that literacy was a crime and knowledge was forbidden. I taught myself freedom, and then I taught a generation. This is how you destroy a kingdom. Not with fire or blood, but with ink and patience, and the stubborn insistence that every person deserves to read, to learn, to be free. They said no slave could hold a book. I held thousands. They said reading was a greater crime than murder. I made it my life's work. They said I was property. I proved I was a person. My name is Elijah. I was born enslaved and I died free. And between those two states, between bondage and liberty, I helped build a bridge of words that thousands crossed to reach the other side.